When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness.
What we're talking about with fibre evidence is the individual fibres are less than 1/10 of the width of a human head hair and less than 1 millimetre in length, and very often they're invisible to the naked eye.
Perth, Australia, where in January 1996, 18-year-old Sarah Spears went missing after leaving the Bayview nightclub in the Claremont area of the city. Tim Clark reported on the case and went on to write a book about it.
She walked down the stairs, made a short walk to a telephone box just around the corner and phoned a taxi. 3 men in a car did see someone who they described as short and blonde and pretty and young, and the police believe that that was Sarah. Within moments of that sighting, she wasn't there.
Moments later, Sarah had disappeared. A massive search began. But 5 months later, there was still no sign of her when another girl went missing from the same area.
Jane Rimmer was also socialising in the Claremont area with friends, not Club Bayview this time, but a venue very close called the Continental Hotel. CCTV on that hotel captured Jane's last known moments. She was leaning on a pole outside that hotel.
Investigators searched for Jane until 2 months later, she was discovered.
Jane's body was later found in an area south of Perth, semi-rural, in bushland, where it had been stripped naked and dumped with horrific knife wounds and injuries. It was at that point WA Police set up the Macro Task Force, which was to become the longest running and most expensive murder investigation in Australian history. They had just over 100 police officers at their peak looking for the man that they believed had taken Sarah and killed Jane.
7 months after Jane's body was found, another girl, 27-year-old Kira Glennon, was leaving the Continental Hotel after a night out with friends.
Kira walked up Stirling Highway, just as Sarah Spears had done. On the opposite side of the road were 3 gentlemen. The last sighting of her by those gentlemen was as she leaned into a car further up Stirling Highway, appearing to talk to the driver.
Less than 3 weeks later, Kira's body was found in bushland to the north of the city.
Her body was also found with native foliage and sporting very similar horrific wounds to her neck and her arms that Jane did. This was obviously a massive blow to the Macro Task Force, who had been hoping to capture this man before he did any more harm.
One line of inquiry suggested that taxis could be the connecting factor in all three incidents. The task force went to work, DNA testing every cab driver in the city and placing undercover officers on the streets. But progress was slow.
Western Australian police put every effort into trying to catch the Claremont killer. But those efforts were making a rod for their own back because of the amount of information they were trying to sift through.
The massive investigation dragged on without success for 8 whole years, until, in 2004, detectives began to believe there was little more they could do.
What they did have left were physical bits of evidence that hadn't been tested because they couldn't be tested because of the technology.
Some of that evidence was in the form of scrapings from under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. At the time, the technology to analyse these tiny traces for DNA did not exist in Australia. But it did here in Britain, where it was known as low-copy DNA testing, and where detectives now sent the samples.
That DNA testing proved that Ciara had a tiny, tiny amount of DNA from the man who killed her left under that fingernail.
At last, detectives had evidence of the man they believed killed Ciara and possibly Jane and Sarah. But there was no match for him on Australia's DNA database. So they turned to tiny fibres found on the bodies of both Jane and Ciara, which appeared to be from the same source, and asked forensic chemist Rhys Powell to begin a brand new analysis to determine that source. Rhys believed some of the fibres on the two girls may have come from a car interior, so he focused his search accordingly.
We attended scrapyards and collected samples from the interiors of vehicles from the eras of the crimes in an attempt to try to understand our data further.
Rhys next used brand new technology to compare these fibres with those found on the bodies of Jane and Ciara. Amazingly, there was a match.
There were 20 grey polyester fibres from Jane Rimmer's hair, as compared against the seat fabric from a 1995 or 96 Holden VS Commodore.
Detectives searched for any Holden Commodore that could be linked to the case, but frustratingly found nothing. The case ran cold again until, in 2016, almost 20 years after the killings, when police began to use new advances in DNA to reassess evidence from cold cases.
The police had the DNA from under Ciara's fingernail. They had matched that to an attack that had taken place years before the Claremont killings had started, the rape of a young woman in a cemetery very close to Claremont. The attacker there had left a kimono behind. When that kimono was tested, that also had the same DNA on it as the attack on Ciara.
On file were fingerprints from the scene of the assault.
When they ran those fingerprints through the database, they came up with a name, Bradley Robert Edwards. A Telstra worker who had attacked a woman at Hollywood Hospital while he was fixing the phones there.
Detectives immediately put the 48-year-old telecoms technician under surveillance.
They followed him to a cinema. They extracted a Sprite bottle from a bin that he had left behind, extracted some DNA from that. It proved a match to the DNA on Ciara, on the kimono, and the rape.
And the evidence began to mount. Investigators also discovered that, as a Telstra employee, Edwards had a company car, a Holden Commodore. Amazingly, 20 years later, it was still on the road. They tracked down the new owners, seized the car for analysis, and again turned to Rhys.
Are we likely to find trace evidence present? On the outset, the chance is low, but there are hidden areas within vehicles, like where the seatbelt latches, the gaps between the seats, on the sides of the seats, and we tried to focus on these really low traffic areas.
Rhys made a discovery: blue polyester fibres similar to those found in Jane Rimmer's hair. Detectives needed to figure out where they could have come from and began to consider the uniforms worn by Telstra employees in the 1990s.
The West Australian Police were able to source example uniform items from that time and source these control materials for us to compare against. It was more or less accepted that he was wearing his work uniform and got in and out of the car multiple times. So that's multiple opportunities for fibres to transfer from clothing and be left in the vehicle. And so in the end, we were able to identify blue polyester fibres, which were indistinguishable in properties to Telstra-issued work uniform pants fibres.
Reese had linked the fibres on the women to a Telstra work vehicle just like the one Edwards drove at the time of the murder. But there was a problem.
We'd used a database that was bespoke. It was designed for this particular investigation. And so it was a new process and hadn't been tested in court. As scientists, it's really important for us to have our work be reviewed.
For a successful prosecution, investigators would need a second opinion. So they turned to UK-based Dr. Ray Palmer, a veteran of fibre analysis with more than 30 years' experience in the field.
I was requested to basically review that report and their findings and establish whether or not the bodies of Ciara Glennon, Jane Rimmer, and a victim of a serious rape could be linked via the fibre evidence.
Ray looked at the evidence, in particular the fibres found in the Holden Commodore, and suggested further analysis.
As part of the review, I suggested the use of TLC, which is thin layer chromatography, on some of the fibres in the case, simply because it would be another test which may exclude the fibres or indeed strengthen their significance.
Ray's new analysis confirmed the fibres in Jane and Ciara's hair matched the fibres found in the Holden Commodore and in the uniform worn by Bradley Edwards.
An evaluative report was produced where I gave my opinion on what the significance of the evidence was and what the strength of that evidence was.
On the strength of that report, Bradley Edwards was charged with the murder of Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. He faced trial at the Western Australia Supreme Court.
The trial of the century is how it was dubbed in Western Australia. It was enormous. It was unprecedented in its scale. But at the heart of it all, really, was the forensic evidence.
Reese was called as an expert witness.
The first day of my testimony really was a summary of our entire involvement, and then the 7 days that followed that were literally just, let's go through each of these individual 98 fibres in detail.
The prosecution also called on Ray Palmer to support Reese's evidence.
He brought it together in such a way that it was, for want of a better phrase, beyond a reasonable doubt that these fibres had got from Edwards' car onto the bodies of Jane and Ciara, and from Edwards' shorts onto the bodies of Jane and Ciara.
The whole point of peer-reviewed literature and scientific consensus is absolutely crucial in providing confidence that an opinion or findings in a case are robust, so that a jury can be confident that the evidence that's presented to them is robust and fair and impartial.
Edwards was found guilty of the murders of Jane and Ciara, but he was found not guilty of the murder of Sarah Spears.
That was basically because her body's never been found. There was no physical evidence. It was a purely circumstantial case. And the police still hold out hope that they might find Sarah's body at some time in the future, because that might give them the forensic evidence that they might possibly be able to reopen the case.
Edwards was sentenced to life imprisonment to serve a minimum of 40 years.
In terms of the fibre evidence, particularly for Jane Rimmer, there was no DNA. So really fibres were critical in that sense to link her to a 1995-96 Holden VS Commodore vehicle.
For me, the conviction of Edward gave the families of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon closure, and indeed provided justice for the two women.
What a forensic pharmacologist does is speak to judges or jury and explain to them what drugs are and what impacts those drugs could have.
December 2019, West Sussex. The peace of pre-Christmas suburbia is broken by a harrowing incident.
One witness said the quiet road that is Hazel Way in Crawley Down was turned into a scene from a horror film.
Journalist Ron K. Phillips reviewed a crime that would shock the local community and become national news.
On the 22nd of December in 2019, detectives were called to the house of Amy and Daniel Appleton, dressed only in his boxer shorts. Appleton had chased his wife Amy out of their house and was attacking her on the driveway.
76-year-old neighbour Sandy Seagrave tried to intervene.
Appleton turned his aggression on her. He took her walking stick and attacked her with that stick. When he'd finished, he then went back to attacking his wife with the very same stick. Members of the public rushed over and tried to help, but despite their efforts and the efforts of paramedics who arrived at the scene shortly afterwards, both women were pronounced dead. When detectives arrived, Appleton was pacing up and down his driveway, angry, agitated, and really out of sorts, I would say.
It was a horrifying and confusing scene. Police were left to determine just what had driven a man to murder his wife and neighbour.
Daniel Appleton's explanation was that he'd had a psychotic episode caused by stress.
But investigators began to query this version of events.
Police searched the house, and when they looked at the computer, they saw that Appleton had been searching for magic mushrooms.
This led detectives to consider if hallucinogenic drugs could have played a part in what unfolded that evening. The answer to this would have huge significance. If Appleton's violence was the result of psychosis brought on by mental health issues, he would likely be charged with manslaughter. But if it was the result of drug use, the charge would be murder.
Did he have a psychotic episode, or had he taken drugs? That was absolutely crucial.
To answer this question, police sought the help of forensic pharmacologist and expert witness Stephanie Sharp.
I was asked to assist the police officers that were dealing with this case in investigating what they thought was magic mushrooms.
By now, it was too late to take blood samples from Appleton because any traces of magic mushrooms would have left his system. Instead, detectives asked Stephanie to review video evidence taken from police body cams.
Appleton was located in the kitchen, having cut himself in very strategic places in what appeared to be an attempted suicide. So it was a very gory scene, and he was covered up and a helicopter was called because an ambulance wouldn't be able to assist.
The video footage of Appleton's behaviour left Stephanie in no doubt.
This is not magic mushrooms or any part thereof. Never have I seen anyone on magic mushrooms behave in such a violent and tragic manner.
Stephanie began to formulate her own theory.
This murder, the level of aggression that was put into it when he killed an elderly lady and his wife, I think that level sparked in my mind, this is N-bomb.
N-bomb is the street name for N-methoxybenzyl, a group of powerful synthetic drugs created to evade the UK's drug laws. Their psychedelic effects can alter a person's thinking, sense of time, and emotions. Their exact consequences are difficult to predict, but can result in panic, paranoia, and uncontrolled violence.
The murders that have occurred through N-bomb are quite vicious and often unprovoked, and it's normally because they have a hallucination that is not familiar to them. Someone murders their best friend because they think they are attacking an intruder in their home, and when they come round, they've just stabbed someone to death, their best friend. That has happened.
Nicole Ryan is a substance abuse specialist who has studied the rise of synthetic drugs and the criminals who create them.
These are people who are just mixing chemicals together and hoping for the best a lot of the time in kind of, you know, alleys, makeshift labs, in different types of areas. There's no hygiene, there's nothing. And therefore you can imagine the kind of chemicals that come out of that. You have derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. Nobody knows what's inside of them. Nobody knows how they will react.
Nicole's work on drug use was born out of a very personal tragedy when her 18-year-old brother Alex mistakenly took N-bomb at a party.
He ended up having an overdose. It was incredibly severe. He had a cardiac arrest, his heart stopped. He had to be resuscitated for 10 minutes when the paramedics found him, and when the toxicology report came back, it was N-bomb. He would have taken enough doses to kill at least 60 people by himself, and he hadn't any clue. He thought he was taking a different drug.
Alex was rushed to hospital, but died 4 days later.
The only hope that he could have had was if CPR was administered to him, but because everybody else had taken the drug at the party, my brother lay dying on the floor and nobody noticed.
For Nicole, users of synthetic drugs need to be far more aware of their potential consequences.
It's manic, you know, how they act on the brain, how they act on people. There's no tests done to them. It's like me mixing chemicals in a pot and drinking it and hoping for the best.
When Stephanie told police that Appleton's manic behaviour could be a result of N-bomb, it took the case in a new direction. But detecting the drug wasn't straightforward.
You won't find it in blood. When blood enters the nails and the hair, those drugs have the potential to deposit themselves in that tissue. So when you start cutting it back, you can see evidence of that drug or whatever you've been taking in that hair sample.
Testing doesn't just identify whether drugs are present, but can actually uncover what they are.
When you know the molecular weight of the drug that you're looking for, in this case it's N-bomb, it's got a specific weight. So if you can look here, 427.97 and 427.98. These are highly likely to be the same peaks. And this is how you know that you have a positive sample containing N-bomb.
Stephanie requested samples from Daniel Appleton, and they were sent for testing. The results could not have been clearer.
When the results had come back from the nail and hair samples that were sent away for Daniel Appleton, all of it came back positive for methadone and N-bomb, and therefore he was charged with intent to murder on 2 counts.
Daniel denied taking any drugs and pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. But Stephanie's evidence concerning the presence of N-bomb in Appleton's system and its effects on his behaviour was pivotal to the case.
The jury didn't really understand fully the implications of taking N-bomb, and neither did the barristers or, in fact, the judge. So that was important in terms of making them aware of what this drug was capable of doing and why it's not found very easily.
After hearing Stephanie's testimony, the jury delivered its verdict.
On the 29th of December in 2020, Appleton was found guilty of 2 counts of murder at Lewes Crown Court. He was sentenced to 26.5 years in prison.
The judge telling him anyone who takes new psychoactive substances is interfering with their own mental processes and is responsible for the consequences.
The evidence that I gave in the Appleton trial was probably the most important evidence I've given in my career, purely because if they hadn't sent away the samples that I'd suggested, they would never have found N-bomb.
The trial had shone a spotlight on the dangers of synthetic drugs, the lives they ruin, and the families they tear apart.
Mrs. Remon told the court, "The manner of Amy's death is impossible to comprehend. We find it hard to come to terms with the knowledge that her death came at the hands of the husband she loved."
You think instantly, don't you, of Amy? How frightened must she have been to see this man she loved, lived with, trusted, turning into a monster? She ran out of the house, the fear she must have been experiencing. And then for Sandy, randomly walking past, wanting to help, attacked in such a vicious and ferocious way. I mean, absolutely devastating. And to think that these two women were killed all for the sake of someone wanting a cheap thrill from taking drugs.
Because there are such a lack of clinical studies on it, because it's dangerous, nobody knows what the potential outcomes are. And if someone says, "I've taken acid before, I can take N-bomb," thinking it's the same, it's a lack of education.